Vlad. Moscow Courier. While you watch my real life, the streets, the deliveries, everything, listen to today's story. Why Russians don't trust banks. And why the answer to that question tells you more about Russian history and Russian psychology than almost anything else you could learn about this country. Subscribe. Let's go. There is a joke that Russians tell about banks. It is not a funny joke. It is the kind of joke that contains more truth than most serious statements. The joke is this. A Russian puts money in a bank on Monday. By Friday, the bank has a new name, a new owner, and the money has a new location which is not with the Russian. This joke is not a joke about Russian pessimism or Russian cynicism or the specific Russian tendency to expect the worst from institutions. It is a joke about Russian history, about what has actually happened to Russian people who trusted banks with their money over the past 100 years. And the history is so consistent and so brutal in its consistency that the distrust it produced is not irrational. It is the most rational response imaginable to a specific pattern of events that has repeated itself with remarkable regularity across generations. To understand why Russians don't trust banks, you need to understand what Russian banks have actually done to Russian people. Not what banks are supposed to do. Not the theoretical function of a banking system in a market economy. What Russian banks have actually done in practice to actual Russian people who actually gave them their actual money. The story begins before the Soviet Union, before the revolution. In the Tsarist period, Russia had a banking system that functioned after a fashion and that served the needs of the merchant and aristocratic classes who had money to deposit. The peasant majority, which was most of Russia, had almost no relationship with formal banking institutions because they had almost no money that required banking. They kept what little they had in physical form, under mattresses, in boxes buried in the ground, in the specific hiding places that people use when they do not trust any institution with what little they have. This was not ignorance. This was the rational behavior of people who had learned through experience that institutions could not be relied upon to protect what was given to them. The revolution of 1917 changed everything about the Russian banking system in ways that set the pattern for everything that followed. The Bolsheviks nationalized the banks immediately. This was not unexpected given their stated ideology. What was less expected, or at least less fully anticipated by the people who had money in those banks, was what nationalization actually meant in practice. It meant that the money that individuals had deposited in private banks was now the property of the Soviet state, not returned, not compensated, simply absorbed into the new order as part of the general expropriation of private property that the revolution required. The people who had savings in Russian banks in 1917 lost those savings, not through bank failure, through deliberate state action that redefined ownership in ways that eliminated individual claims to what had previously been individual property. This was the first lesson. The lesson that what you put in a bank can be taken by the state whenever the state decides it needs it more than you do. The Soviet period that followed created a banking system of a completely different kind. There were no private banks in the Soviet Union. There was Sberbank, the savings bank of the Soviet state. And there was the understanding that your relationship with Sberbank was not quite the same as the relationship that citizens of Western countries had with their banks. You could deposit money. You could withdraw money within certain limits. You could accumulate savings in a nominal sense. But the money in your Sberbank account was not quite yours in the way that property is yours in a system with genuine private property rights. It was yours in the Soviet sense, which meant it was yours as long as the state did not need it for something else. As long as the policies that governed what you could do with it did not change. As long as the system itself continued to function in roughly the way it was currently functioning. Soviet citizens understood this at some level, even when they did not articulate it clearly. They kept Sberbank accounts because there was nowhere else to put money, and because the alternative of keeping everything in physical form had its own risks. But they also kept physical cash at home. Under mattresses, in envelopes in drawers, in the specific hiding places that their parents and grandparents had used, because the lesson of 1917 had been passed down through families even when it was not spoken directly. The lesson that what you put in an institution can be taken, That physical cash in your own hands is the only money that is truly yours. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and the second great lesson of Russian banking history arrived with a speed and a completeness that the first lesson had not quite matched. The collapse of the Soviet economic system produced hyperinflation of a kind that most people in stable Western economies have never experienced and cannot easily imagine. In 1992, the annual inflation rate in Russia exceeded 2,500%. 2,500%. The money that Soviet citizens had saved in their spur bank accounts over decades of careful accumulation lost almost all of its value in a period of months. A person who had saved enough in their spur bank account to buy a car in 1990 had enough by 1993 to buy a pair of shoes, if they were lucky. The savings of an entire generation were wiped out not through bank failure in the traditional sense, but through the inflation that the collapse of the Soviet economic system produced. People who had done everything right, who had worked and saved and accumulated over decades, who had trusted the system with what they had accumulated, lost it, all of it, or almost all of it, in a process that they had no power to prevent and no recourse to address. This was the second lesson, and it arrived so quickly after the first lesson had been taught by the previous generation that the combined effect on Russian attitudes toward banking institutions was profound and lasting. The grandparents had learned in 1917 that the state could take what you put in a bank. The parents had learned in 1992 that inflation could destroy what you put in a bank. By the time the children of the 1992 generation were adults and making their own financial decisions, the distrust of banks was not an attitude that needed to be taught. It was the air they breathed, the background assumption against which all financial decisions were made. Of course you keep cash at home. Of course you do not put everything in a bank. Of course you hedge. Of course you diversify across multiple hiding places and multiple forms of value storage, not because you are paranoid, because you are rational, because the history of what banks have actually done to Russian people is right there in living memory, told by grandparents and parents who experienced it directly. Chapter to the history of why Russians do not trust banks in ways that reinforced everything the previous two lessons had taught. The crisis of 1998 was different from the crisis of 1992 in its specific mechanism, but identical in its practical effect on ordinary Russians who had trusted financial institutions with their savings. The 1990s in Russia had been a decade of chaotic economic transformation. The transition from a Soviet command economy to something resembling a market economy had created opportunities for some and disasters for many. A new banking sector had emerged. Private banks, commercial banks, banks with names and logos and branches and advertising campaigns that promised returns and security and the normal functioning of a financial system in a normal country. Russians who had survived 1992 with their distrust intact had largely avoided these new banks. But a new generation of Russians, younger people who had not directly experienced 1992 and who were living through the relative economic stabilization of the mid-1990s, had begun to engage with the new banking system, had begun to deposit money, to take out mortgages, to participate in the financial system as if it were a normal financial system in a normal country. In August 1998, the Russian government defaulted on its debt. The ruble collapsed. The banking system went into crisis. Banks froze accounts, suspended withdrawals, declared bankruptcy. The money that Russians had deposited in these new private banks in the confidence that the new Russia was different from the old Russia and that financial institutions could be trusted became inaccessible. Then it became lost. The specific technical mechanisms varied from bank to bank. The practical result was consistent. Russians who had trusted banks lost what they had trusted them with, for the third time in living memory, for the third time in the experience of a population that was already among the most financially traumatized in the world. The third lesson confirmed what the first two had established. The pattern was clear. You trust a bank. Something happens. You lose what you trusted it with. The something that happens changes each time. Revolution, hyperinflation, financial crisis. But the result is consistent. You lose. The 1990s also introduced a fourth mechanism of loss that was specific to the chaotic conditions of that decade, and that added its own chapter to the Russian banking distrust story. The pyramid schemes, the financial frauds, the organizations that presented themselves as investment opportunities or savings instruments, and that collected money from Russians who were desperate for returns in an inflationary environment, and who did not have the financial literacy or the regulatory protection to distinguish legitimate financial products from fraud. The most famous of these was MMM, a scheme run by a man named Sergei Mavrodi, that at its peak had enrolled somewhere between 5 and 15 million participants across Russia. People who gave their money to MMM in the belief that it was a legitimate investment vehicle, and who received, for a period, the returns that were promised. Until they did not. Until the scheme collapsed in 1994, and the money was gone, and the participants were left with certificates that were worth nothing, and the specific humiliation of having been deceived by something that in retrospect seemed obvious, but that in the context of a chaotic and unfamiliar new financial environment had seemed like an opportunity. MMM was the largest and most famous, but it was not the only one. The 1990s in Russia were filled with schemes of this kind, operating at various scales and with various levels of sophistication. The cumulative effect of these schemes on Russian attitudes toward financial institutions was to add a layer of fraud risk to the already established risks of state expropriation, hyperinflation, and systemic crisis. Not only could banks take your money through policy changes, not only could inflation destroy its value, not only could financial crises make it inaccessible, but the institution itself might be a fraud, might not be what it presented itself as being, might have been designed from the beginning to collect money and then disappear with it. The rational response to this accumulation of risk was the response that most Russians adopted. Keep your money in a form that does not require trusting an institution. Keep cash. Keep hard assets, keep gold, keep foreign currency, keep anything that holds its value independently of the functioning of a financial institution. The cash culture that this history produced is one of the most visible expressions of Russian banking distrust in daily life. Russia is a cash society in ways that consistently surprise visitors from countries where digital payment has largely displaced physical currency. Not because Russians do not have access to digital payment systems, they do. The banking infrastructure in Russia today is actually quite sophisticated, and the adoption of digital payments has increased substantially in recent years. But the cash culture persists alongside the digital infrastructure in ways that reflect the distrust of institutions that the history has produced. Russians keep cash at home, not small amounts for immediate expenses, substantial amounts. Amounts that in other countries would be considered reckless to keep in physical form given the risks of theft or fire or simple loss. Russians accept these risks as preferable to the risk of institutional failure. The risk that a bank will lose your money, freeze your account, or simply cease to exist is experienced as more serious than the risk that your physical cash will be stolen or destroyed. This preference reflects the specific history of what has actually happened more often than the other. The foreign currency dimension of Russian cash culture is particularly significant and particularly visible to outside observers. Russians save in dollars and euros, not exclusively, not uniformly across all income levels and all regions. But the practice of keeping savings in foreign currency, particularly in US dollars, is widespread enough to be a defining feature of Russian financial behavior. The logic is simple, and it is the direct product of the inflation experiences of 1992 and 1998. The ruble lost most of its value in those crises. Foreign currencies did not. A person who had their savings in dollars in 1992 kept their savings. A person who had them in rubles lost most of theirs. The lesson was clear, and it was remembered. If you are going to hold savings outside of physical assets, you hold them in a currency that has a track record of not losing its value catastrophically. The dollar has that track record in Russian experience. The ruble does not. The distrust of banks also manifests in the Russian preference for real estate as a savings vehicle. If you cannot trust banks to hold your money, and you cannot trust the ruble to hold its value, Then the most reliable store of value available to ordinary Russians is physical property. An apartment cannot be inflated away. It cannot be frozen in an account. It cannot disappear because a bank went bankrupt. It is there, physical, yours in a way that money in an account is not quite yours. The Russian obsession with owning property rather than renting is partly cultural in the sense that ownership is deeply valued in Russian culture. But it is also financial in the sense that property is the most reliable store of value available in an environment where the reliability of financial institutions has been repeatedly and catastrophically demonstrated to be limited. Russians who can buy property, not just because they want to live in it, because they want a form of savings that cannot be taken by a failing institution or destroyed by inflation. The gold dimension is smaller but real. Russian households hold more physical gold per capita than the households of most comparable countries. The tradition of keeping gold jewelry as a store of value, of giving gold as gifts at significant life events, of accumulating physical precious metals as a hedge against the failures of paper and institutional finance, is connected to the same historical lessons. Gold holds its value across political and economic upheavals in ways that rubles and bank accounts have repeatedly failed to do. The grandmother who kept her gold earrings through 1917 and 1992 and 1998 kept something. The grandmother who kept her ruble savings in Sberbank kept something that was worth much less, or sometimes nothing by the time the crisis passed. The younger generation of Russians has a more complicated relationship with banks than their parents and grandparents. The banking system in Russia today is more stable and more regulated than it was in the 1990s. The deposit insurance system that protects individual deposits up to a certain amount provides a form of security that did not exist during the crises. Digital banking has made financial services more convenient and more accessible. And the generation that is now in its 20s and 30s did not directly experience 1992 or 1998 in the way that their parents did. They know the stories. They have heard the lessons, but they have also lived through a period of relative banking stability that their parents and grandparents did not experience. The result is a generation that uses banks more freely than the previous generation, that holds more of its savings in digital form, that is more comfortable with financial institutions as a matter of practical convenience, but that also, when asked directly, expresses the same fundamental distrust that the history has produced. They use the banks. They do not fully trust them. They keep some cash at home. They hold some savings in foreign currency or in physical assets. They participate in the financial system while maintaining the hedge that Russian history has taught is the rational response to a financial system that has repeatedly failed the people who trusted it completely. The banking crisis of 2022 added another chapter to this history. The sanctions imposed on Russia following the events of that year produced a new set of financial disruptions that affected Russian banking in ways that were different in their mechanism from previous crises, but that reinforced the same fundamental lesson that the previous crises had taught. Several major Russian banks were cut off from the international financial system. The SWIFT payment system became inaccessible for transactions involving sanctioned institutions. Visa and MasterCard suspended operations in Russia. Russians who had been using international payment cards found those cards suddenly non-functional outside Russia. Russians who had savings in foreign currency accounts at sanctioned banks found those accounts subject to new restrictions. The specific technical consequences varied by institution and by individual circumstance. The general effect was to remind a population that was already predisposed to distrust financial institutions that financial institutions remain subject to forces beyond their control and beyond the control of the individuals who trust them with their money. The Russian government's response to the 2022 banking disruptions was relatively swift and relatively effective in preventing a full-scale banking panic of the kind that the 1998 crisis had produced. The central bank raised interest rates dramatically to defend the ruble. The deposit insurance system functioned. Domestic payment systems that had been developed as alternatives to Visa and MasterCard, most importantly the Mir card system, expanded rapidly to fill the gap left by the departing international networks. The ruble, after an initial collapse in the first weeks of the crisis, recovered to levels that surprised many outside observers. The Russian banking system did not collapse in 2022 the way it had in 1998. This was a genuine difference from previous crises, and it reflected a more robust regulatory framework and a more capable central bank than had existed during previous upheavals. But the psychological effect of 2022 on Russian banking distrust was real nonetheless. The specific lesson of 2022 was different from the lessons of 1917 and 1992 and 1998. It was not the lesson that your savings would be inflated away, or that your bank would fail, or that the state would expropriate what you had deposited. It was the lesson that the international financial system, which many Russians had come to use and rely on as a more stable alternative to purely domestic institutions, was also subject to political forces that could make it inaccessible overnight. The Russian who had diversified into foreign currency savings and international banking relationships as a hedge against domestic institutional risk discovered that this hedge had its own vulnerabilities. The diversification that seemed rational given Russian domestic financial history turned out to be vulnerable to geopolitical forces that no individual financial decision could protect against. The lesson was not that diversification was wrong. The lesson was that there is no completely safe place to put your money, that every store of value is vulnerable to something, that the question is not how to eliminate risk but how to distribute it across enough different forms that no single event can destroy everything. The Russian response to this lesson has been consistent with the broader pattern of Russian financial behavior. Keep some cash, keep some foreign currency where accessible, keep some in domestic accounts for convenience, keep some in property, keep some in gold or other physical assets. Do not put everything anywhere. The specific allocation varies by individual circumstance and risk tolerance and income level. But the principle of distribution across multiple stores of value, of never trusting any single institution or any single currency or any single form of value storage with everything you have, is the rational response that Russian financial history has produced in Russian financial behavior. I think about all of this when I am doing my deliveries. When I hand a package to someone at their door and they pay cash. In Moscow, cash payment is still common in ways that in other major European cities it is not. The preference for cash is not just habit. It is not just the inconvenience of setting up digital payment. It is connected to the deeper distrust of systems. The feeling that cash in hand is real in a way that digital records are not quite real. That the number on a screen can change in ways that the physical note in your hand cannot. That what you hold is yours in a way that what an institution holds for you is not quite yours. These are not irrational feelings. They are feelings produced by a specific history that has repeatedly demonstrated their validity. The mattress saving tradition in Russia is real, and it is widespread in ways that financial statistics do not fully capture because, by definition, money kept outside the banking system does not appear in banking statistics. Estimates of the amount of cash held outside the Russian banking system vary widely because the nature of the phenomenon makes precise measurement impossible. But the phenomenon itself is not disputed. Russians keep cash at home. A lot of cash. In amounts that people from countries with more stable financial histories find either impressive or alarming depending on their perspective. The specific hiding places have evolved over time. Mattresses are less common than the expression suggests. Safes built into walls or floors are more common. False bottoms in furniture. Envelopes behind loose tiles. The hiding place is a personal choice, and it reflects the individual's assessment of what is most secure in their specific circumstances. But the principle is consistent across circumstances and income levels. Keep some of what you have in a form and a location that does not require trusting anyone else with it. The gold jewelry tradition in Russian families is another expression of the same principle. Russian women, particularly of older generations, accumulated gold jewelry not primarily as decoration but as savings. The gold earrings and the gold necklace and the gold ring were the savings account that did not require a bank, and that could not be inflated away, and that could be converted to cash in an emergency by selling to any of the gold buyers that exist in every Russian city. This tradition has diminished somewhat in younger generations, who have more options and who live in a more stable financial environment than their grandmothers did. But it has not disappeared. The understanding that physical precious metal is a reliable store of value in ways that paper and digital records are not, is still present in Russian financial culture, and it still shapes the gift-giving practices at significant life events. Gold at a wedding, gold at a birth, gold passed from mother to daughter, not just as jewelry, as savings, as the hedge that does not depend on the functioning of any institution. The real estate obsession that I mentioned in the previous section deserves additional attention because it is perhaps the most economically significant expression of Russian banking distrust. The Russian housing market is shaped to an unusual degree by the use of property as a savings vehicle rather than just as housing. Russians buy apartments not just to live in them, but to have them. To have something physical and permanent that holds value across the financial crises that experience has taught them to expect. This demand from savings-motivated buyers rather than just housing-motivated buyers drives up prices in ways that make Moscow real estate expensive relative to local income levels. It also means that the Russian housing market does not behave entirely like a housing market. It behaves partly like a commodity market where the commodity happens to be apartments. The demand is driven not just by the need for shelter, but by the need for a reliable store of value in an environment where reliable stores of value are in limited supply. The younger generation's relationship with cryptocurrency is interesting in this context. Russia has a significant cryptocurrency adoption rate relative to many comparable countries. The adoption is driven in part by the same logic that drives the cash culture and the gold tradition and the real estate preference. Cryptocurrency, whatever its other characteristics, is not controlled by any government or any central bank. It cannot be inflated away by a government printing money. It cannot be expropriated by a state that decides it needs your savings more than you do. It is not dependent on the functioning of the international banking system. These characteristics make it attractive to people whose financial culture has been shaped by repeated demonstrations that government-controlled currencies and government-affiliated financial institutions cannot be fully trusted. The Russian cryptocurrency adopter and the Russian grandmother with gold earrings hidden under the floorboards are responding to the same historical lesson with the tools available to their respective generations. I ride through Moscow every day and I pass banks. There are many of them. The Russian banking sector has consolidated significantly since the chaos of the 1990s, and the surviving institutions are more stable and more regulated than their predecessors. But the billboards advertising deposit rates and the branches with their glass fronts and their reassuring logos do not quite overcome the history that every Russian carries with them. The history that says trust carefully, diversify, keep something in your own hands. Do not let any single institution hold everything you have. This is not paranoia. This is the rational financial behavior of a population that has been taught by its own experience that the precaution is warranted. The most financially sophisticated behavior in Russian culture is not the behavior of the person who trusts the system most completely. It is the behavior of the person who understands the system well enough to know exactly how much to trust it and exactly where to stop. Subscribe if you want to keep seeing Moscow through my camera. Every week something new from these streets and from the lives that are lived on them. Come back next week and leave me a comment. Do you keep cash at home? I read every single one.